Just a couple housekeeping items before we get started. You probably heard this a bunch of times, but we got to do it. If you could, please turn off your cell phones or at least silence them out of respect for the speaker. Also, afterwards we're going to have Q&A, so you can either raise your hand if you're in the room, or you can text it to Poll Everywhere, which is going to be 22333. So you would text IST Startup space your question to 22333. You can also use Twitter using the hashtag IST Startup. Also, feel free to take pictures or video and upload it to our Flickr or Instagram using the hashtag IST Startup. Also, we are taking pictures and videotaping this session, so if you feel uncomfortable with that, if you can move to the back of the room or come down afterwards and speak with me, and we'll make sure that you're not in any of the shots. Yeah, so that's that. And then now, Arianna Simpson. Arianna Simpson co-founded an enterprise software startup in the loyalty program space, led sales and partner relations at Shoptiques, a Y Combinator-backed e-commerce startup, and worked at Facebook in global marketing solutions before she decided to pursue her interest in Bitcoin full-time and joined BitGo as the third employee. Arianna frequently speaks and writes about the financial, political, and technological implications of Bitcoin and the underlying protocol. She holds a dual BA with the highest honors and is an advisor to the Penn State University Bitcoin Club. So let's welcome Arianna Simpson.
Thank you. Hi guys, I'm really excited to be here. I must say, if somebody had told me a couple years ago that I would be coming back to Penn State to talk about magical internet money, I probably wouldn't have believed them, but it's great to be here. So to kick things off, I'd like to get a sense of kind of who's in the audience. So how many people here would say that they are Bitcoin experts, know a lot about it? Okay, one. How about intermediate knowledge? Okay, a few. And how about have no idea, just are kind of curious to see what this thing is all about? All right, okay, good. So the reason I didn't come with a deck is because I wanted to be able to kind of tailor the conversation to who's in the audience. And so I'll kind of give a broad overview of how I got into Bitcoin. Then I'll talk about why I think it actually matters and why it's worth being in this space. At that point, we'll kind of see where people's knowledge level lands at. But I think one of the most interesting aspects is also where we're heading in the future of Bitcoin. So I'll kind of wrap up by talking about that. So my first entry into the Bitcoin space is a little bit of an unusual story in the sense that when I went to Penn State, I graduated with a degree in international politics and Spanish, which has nothing to do with cryptography and less to do with computer science. So I was kind of an unusual participant in the space in that sense. So, well, how did I get there? Basically, I was working at Facebook at the time in global marketing solutions. So I was working with some of the biggest advertisers in consumer packaged goods. So things like Coca-Cola, Bacardi, L'Oreal, things like that. Again, not related at all. But while I was doing this, I had a good friend whose name is Ryan Shea. And he basically, you may have heard of him because he also co-founded a Bitcoin startup. So what they do is, it's called OneName, and they do identity storage in the blockchain, which is one of the most innovative uses of the Bitcoin protocol, actually the Namecoin protocol at this point in time. But basically, Ryan was just a really good friend of mine, and we lived a couple blocks away in New York, and we would grab drinks, and he at one point started talking about this Bitcoin thing. And you know, we'd talk about it, and I had no idea what he was saying. He was just like, rah, 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 Bitcoin, Bitcoin, Bitcoin. And at a certain point, you know, I started trying to drown him out, and that didn't work. I would listen to the conversation of the table next to us. Eventually, that got old as well. So I said, all right, well, maybe there's something to this. I should probably investigate. So I started researching, and in the magical place that is the internet, I found the white paper. And the Bitcoin white paper was a paper that was published in 2009 by Satoshi Nakamoto, who is the anonymous creator of Bitcoin. And basically, Satoshi, who may be a he or a she or a collective, we don't know, explained in this paper the motivations for creating Bitcoin, as well as how the system would actually work. And so in the early days, this was in 2009, so for the first couple of years, there were some like deep, dark internet forums where people would talk about this, mostly cryptographers, but it wasn't really a very widely followed topic. But by this point, which was about 2 years ago, people were starting to pay a little bit more attention to it because the price was starting to rise. So anyways, I read the white paper, and it's not something that you get all in one go. So it's only a few pages long, but it's just so dense that it really takes a while to grasp the whole thing. So anyways, what I did capture, right from the beginning was that this had the potential to revolutionize not just payments, not just finance, but entire industries that have nothing to do with banking. And so I was like, wow, this is incredible. And I went from thinking that my friend was insane to actually being also one of those crazy Bitcoin people. So during this time, I continued to do research, and I became known at Facebook in the New York office, which is where I was working, as the go-to Bitcoin person. So anytime anybody had a question or wanted to talk about Bitcoin, they were like, oh, go talk to Arianna. She'll talk to you for days about it. So I was just really excited about it and saw a lot of potential there. The way I actually moved into the industry was a lot of chance, and I actually think that this is interesting, not particularly because it's my story, but because I think this happens a lot in startups, and it's really a question of like seizing events that kind of accidentally happen to you. So same friend of mine and I decided to go to a Bitcoin meetup one evening, and we get there, and there's maybe 30 people, and I'm one of 2 women, and I'm actually excited to see so many ladies in the crowd here. It's very rare. But anyway, so I have a horrific experience, like really bad. I mean, I've been in tech since I graduated, so I've had my fair share of awkward incidents, but this was next level. Things like, you don't look like you would know anything about Bitcoin, or, women think in terms of efficiency and effectiveness? Genuinely shocked. And they meant these things as compliments, but it was really, really pretty bad. So I decide to, I'm pretty livid when I leave, and I write a blog post about it. And much to my surprise, this kind of blows up. And all of a sudden, I'm getting calls from like mainstream media, Business Insider republished it, I'm being asked to do interviews. I'm completely shocked. This is the first thing I've ever written. I was like, ugh, how did this happen? But anyways, one of the positive I got a lot of death threats, which was always a good way to start your Tuesday. But basically, I was really surprised and actually pleased by the fact that I got a lot of positive feedback as well. So there was this sort of mysterious hidden community of people who are like, oh, I've heard about this Bitcoin thing. I'm really curious about it, but I don't know how to get started. So you actually seem like, not like a crazy far fringe libertarian, which was what most of the Bitcoin community was at that time. Maybe you could blog more about it. And for me, I thought about it, and this was my opportunity to also create a product out of all the hours that I was spending of my free time researching this stuff. So I said, okay, that's not a bad idea. And I also really didn't want to be known for anything related to gender. For me, gender only became a thing because it was made to be so. But I was there to talk about Bitcoin. I didn't particularly care if anybody was male or female. So anyways, I started writing about kind of the implications of the protocol, some of the more technical aspects, what I saw as the connections to political theory, game theory, and actually linked it back to some of the classes I had taken in college. So that was actually a aha moment of illumination. But yeah, so basically at that point, at one point I wrote an article about multi-signature technology, which was one of the recent advancements in the Bitcoin protocol. And I'll dive into what that is in a little bit, but basically I wrote this post and shamelessly emailed it to the founder of a company called BitGo, which you may have noticed is where I currently work. And so the conversation quickly went from, I just wrote this thing and I mentioned your company because you guys are at the forefront of this, to like, hey, when can you start working for us? So I ended up deciding that moving to San Francisco and pursuing this crazy Bitcoin internet money was going to be my move, and so that's what I did. More interesting than my personal story in Bitcoin is why it actually matters. And in order to really grasp, the answer to that question, it's worth thinking about a fundamental problem that some of you, if you are computer science or are taking any computer science majors or are taking any cryptography classes, may be familiar with. And that is called the Byzantine generals problem. Does anybody know what the Byzantine generals problem is? No? Okay. All right. Well, if anybody does, raise your hand, and I'll send you $50 worth of Bitcoin at the end of my talk. Okay, no, you're not shy. You just actually don't know. Okay, that's fine. So basically, the Byzantine generals problem has been around since like the 70s. And basically, it's a hypothetical scenario in which there's an army that's laying siege to a city, and the generals are posted at various points around the perimeter of the city walls. And they need to communicate with one another to coordinate an attack. And the only way that they can talk to each other is by using a messenger. The problem is they need to be sure that none of the generals are actually traitors. And so they need a way to be able to trustlessly communicate and make sure that their plan is coordinated without actually having the possibility of a traitor disrupting it. So, well, how does this link to Bitcoin? Basically, Bitcoin is the first practical solution to the Byzantine generals problem that has ever been proposed. And that's why the rest of the world at the beginning was like, whatever, what is this weird thing? But the people who actually had been studying this and had been, this problem has stumped the top cryptographers, some of the top minds in computer science for literally over 30 years. And so these people were like, oh my gosh, this is incredible. So there was this very strong disconnect between people who had never heard of it and didn't even realize what the solution was, and the other people who were like, wow, this is really revolutionary. So essentially, again, Bitcoin is the first practical solution to this problem. And what it does, in practical terms, is it allows parties who don't have trust between each other to transfer digital assets in a way that's immediate, doesn't require any trust, and can be immediately verified by any party on the network. And the way Bitcoin does this is through the use of a public ledger. So the public ledger in Bitcoin is literally a public list, like you can download it right now if you want to, of every single transaction that has ever occurred in Bitcoin since Bitcoin was created in 2009. And that ledger is at the center of the Bitcoin network and is what allows that trustlessness to exist. Because, unlike a private ledger that a bank might maintain or a database that any company might have, this is decentralized, and every participant in the network can see it. Therefore, it's not possible for any individual to make changes to it without the network being aware of it, which is where kind of the brilliance of it lies. So, again, in terms of how this impacts you, the most common use case is if you need to send money to somebody, you need an intermediary to do so, which is a bank. That implies that you are trusting the bank, at least one bank, possibly more, to execute the transaction for you. There are, particularly after the financial crisis, there was a lot of question as to whether we should be trusting banks or traditional financial institutions. Some of that trust has been restored, but even today, there's tons of polls of millennials, which I suppose is all of us, and we don't think that the traditional banks generally represent our best interests or are really serving our needs. That aside, there's actually also an economic consideration that most people don't make, but that's actually very valid. So, let's say, I don't know if you guys follow the news, but for example, in 2014, there were about 700 data breaches that affected things like JP Morgan, Target, Home Depot. So thousands or millions, of personal data of consumers, as well as credit card numbers, things like that, were stolen. So, when something like that happens, let's say they steal your debit card number and your account gets emptied. Well, the good news is there are things like FDIC consumer protections, which will reimburse you up to $250,000. So, you're not like SOL if that happens. However, the reality of it is those costs are being borne by the bank. So when something like that happens, what actually occurs? So the bank needs to spend hundreds of millions of dollars redoing its IT infrastructure, which sucked, and they should have done in the first place, but they don't until something goes wrong. That's very expensive. Hundreds of millions of dollars are coming out of somewhere. Also, they have to reimburse if any funds are actually stolen. In reality, those costs, although you get your money back, are being passed back to the consumers. So, and that's occurring through things like banking fees, higher rates on your credit card, and things like that. So even though the banks manage to, not give you an immediate bill or not make you suffer an immediate loss, again, they're getting their money from somewhere, and that somewhere is all of us. Let's be nice to the banks for a second and say that in the US, we have a pretty functional financial system. Most people don't have to worry about whether their assets are going to disappear from one day to the next. But unfortunately, most of the rest of the world doesn't have that luxury. So there are currently about 3 billion people who are unbanked or underbanked across the world. And what does that mean? That means that they don't have access to things that we consider, obvious, like a bank account. Why don't they? Well, a number of reasons. Some of it's infrastructure. It's difficult to physically get to the bank if the road gets washed away, which is a real problem in some parts of the world. But more importantly, banks are not catering to these sections of the population, which for the most part are the lowest income tiers. And they don't particularly care to cater to these people because they are not a very lucrative market segment. Of course, this is very detrimental for the people who actually need access to banking infrastructure because they aren't able to do things like get loans, store their money in any way that's not literally just holding cash, and that sort of thing. So again, let's optimistically say the system works in the US or Western Europe and North America, not so in lots of other parts of the world. And this all sounds very plausible in the abstract, but it's really kind of a different story when you actually live it. So Steve mentioned I worked at Shoptiques, which is a Y Combinator startup in New York, and I was doing kind of sales and marketing for them. And I was there for about a year, and when I left, I was really burnt out. So I did the only logical thing and bought a one-way ticket to Namibia. So I flew to Namibia to visit a friend of mine who I'd gone to school with I went to high school in Italy, so we were friends from there. And she was working for a nonprofit there. And I visited her for a few days, and then I was like, well, I guess I'll just travel around. So I went to Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, South Africa, and back to Namibia. And the part of the story that's relevant is the part in Zimbabwe. I was staying in Victoria Falls, and I had done some of the touristy stuff, aka look at the actual falls, and then I decided I wanted to go exploring a little bit. So I started visiting parts of the shanty towns and kind of going into areas where I probably shouldn't have been going by myself, but anyways, I did. So I met this woman, and we had some really interesting conversations around the state of the economy. And at the time, Zimbabwe was just coming out of a really, really bad era in terms of their markets, because basically the president, also known as dictator, but you're not allowed to say that there, Mugabe had basically been printing money in a completely irresponsible way for quite some time, and using that to fund his own expenses as well as to bribe his military officials. But apparently he had not taken Econ 101, which I hope all of you guys take, because what this caused was rampant hyperinflation. So Zimbabwe suffered from the second worst hyperinflation in the history of money. And what that meant in real terms was that if you have $10,000 today, tomorrow it's going to be $5,000, the day after $2,500, and so on and so forth. So it doesn't take a math major to figure out that very soon you have no money. And so obviously this was a problem on an individual basis, but it was also broader than that in terms of the system. So hospitals had doctors just stopped showing up to work because they weren't getting paid. even if they did show up, they had no medicine because the hospital couldn't afford to buy any. If you took your literal wheelbarrow full of cash, which is how much you needed to bring with you to actually be able to buy anything, to the store, chances are you would get there and there wouldn't be anything to buy because the store owners didn't have enough money to pay their vendors, and so there were no products. So you literally have this scenario where it's like nothing can be bought, everybody's broke, and nobody knows what to do about it. So, except, of course, the government officials, they're all doing just fine and dandy. So what happens? Well, the Zimbabwe eventually switched back to the dollar to restabilize their economy. And, now if you go there, they're using actual dollars for commerce, but of course they can tell that you're a tourist because you're the wrong color. And so everyone is like trying to sell you $1 trillion Zimbabwean note. Of course, if you have any sense, you don't buy any. But basically, how does this link back to Bitcoin? Well, had there been any sort of alternative way for the people to transact and interact with the financial system that was not controlled by a central government or a central entity, a disaster of that magnitude could have been avoided. And Zimbabwe is not unique in that sense. I mean, they had it really, really bad. But it's certainly not the only case. Like Argentina has had incredibly bad hyperinflation. In Cyprus, the government at one point just said, okay, as of tomorrow, we're going to take, I think it was 10% of your money just because. So, we're lucky in the United States that, tax day was yesterday, so sometimes you feel like a lot of your money evaporates, but generally speaking, we're doing pretty well. But in a lot of the world, that's not really the case, and Bitcoin has the ability to actually change that. The great thing about it is also that, I just mentioned that there's not access to a lot of banking infrastructure, but the rate at which people are gaining access to the internet through smartphones is rising much more quickly than the rate at which access to banking is happening. So Bitcoin is incredible in that it allows you to be your own bank. You have control of your private keys, which are basically the digital equivalent of the key to a safe deposit box. And if you have that, you are fully in control of your money, which means that you don't need to rely on a bank that's not serving your needs if you're a rural farmer in the middle of nowhere. In a lot of, for example, Africa, so micropayments, microtransactions, particularly ones done via mobile, are very, very common already. So things like M-Pesa, which you may be familiar with, are already being widely used. So there's not a big jump to consumer adoption. In the US, like now we have Apple Pay and things like that, but it's actually a very small percentage of the population who regularly uses mobile payments. In our demographic, there's a lot more of that, but if you ask your parents or your grandparents, that's not very common. Whereas in these countries, something like 70% of people are already doing it. So again, it's not a big jump to have Bitcoin take hold in something in some of these countries. The other major use case, which affects a large percentage of the world, is the remittance market. So $583 billion of global remittances were sent and received in 2014. So, that's a huge amount of money. It's really $583 billion dwarfs a lot of entire industries. And unfortunately, the cost of sending these remittances is enormous. So you have some middlemen players like Western Union and a few others who are making exorbitant sums off the top from these. So I sent some funds back to Zimbabwe to an orphanage that I had visited when I was there, and it cost me 20% of what I sent. Which was frankly infuriating. And can you imagine being like a migrant worker here in the US and having 20% of what you've just worked for just taken off the top by something like Western Union? It's really not ideal. And Bitcoin allows these transactions to be done practically free, literally free, because of the way the system works. So Miners, who are the ones who are actually validating the transactions and making sure that these are processed, making the payments go through, have a financial incentive, which is that basically when they complete this work, they're rewarded with Bitcoin. So they are not reliant on your transaction fees in order to actually do this work, which is why the system is able to function. I hope I haven't lost you. Any of it still making sense? Okay. So those are some of the main use cases that are currently either in existence or being developed. All of these are real applications that, again, they may not be fully functional now because we're missing infrastructure. So, you might be able to send a Bitcoin remittance, but you need to make sure that somebody on the other side actually has the software or the Bitcoin ATM or whatever it is that they need to receive it. But in addition to that, part of it's also just a network issue. So right now there are about 8.9 million Bitcoin wallets in existence, which means that there are fewer than 8.9 million people currently using Bitcoin, which is actually quite small. There's about 100,000 transactions on the network every day. Visa is processing like orders of magnitude more than that. But I think it's really just a matter of time. If you think of Bitcoin as being 6 years old, it seems like a pretty long time. Like you go through college, you graduate, you move somewhere else, start working. Decent amount of time. But if you look at Bitcoin compared to the history of gold, for example, or the history of money in general, 6 years is practically nothing. So it's basically, I think it's very unrealistic to assume that in a matter of so little time, you could have a fully baked network with tens of millions of participants at any given point. The good news is that the network's growing quite a bit. So, it is taking hold a lot in the US for sure, but also in other parts of the world. The Philippines, it's really taking off, and other markets where people have an immediate use case. And Argentina, actually, which I mentioned earlier, it's funny because people say one of the big criticisms of Bitcoin is, oh, well, it's really volatile, which is great if you're like day trading, but it's bad if you're like, all of a sudden, oops, half your savings evaporated. Let's hope it goes up next month. That's not really great. But it all depends on what you're comparing it to, because in Argentina, for example, when the hyperinflation got really, really bad, the peso was just going down. So at least the good news is if Bitcoin is volatile, it goes down and up, whereas the peso was purely going down. And the reason for that level of instability in Bitcoin is also related to the size of the network. So right now, the market cap, so basically if you take the total number of Bitcoins in existence, which right now is about 13 million, and you multiply it by the current price, which is about $226, you end up with less than $5 billion market cap. And what does that mean? Well, that means, so Bridgewater, for example, is the biggest hedge fund in the world. They have $150 billion in assets under management. They could buy all of Bitcoin 30 times over and still have cash to spare. So in the relative global scale of the financial system, Bitcoin is still very, very small. If you're banking on Bitcoin based on what it is right now, then you're in the wrong business. What you need to see, though, is the ability to look beyond that and look at what it can be and what it's going to be in 10, 20, 30 years, which seems like an impossibly long time, but I'm sure it will happen eventually. Okay, as I'm sure you can tell, I am pretty positive about Bitcoin. There's a lot of good that can come from it, but what are some of the negative aspects? Well, the first point I'd like to address is it's not an actual criticism, but the media loves to talk about it, so I'm sure you guys have heard of it. And basically that is that Bitcoin is the perfect enabler for all kinds of dirty transactions, drug things, all kinds of bad activity, illegal activity. So the one thing that I would love to say to all the journalists who are publishing this kind of article is, Newsflash, this stuff is already happening. Like, I don't know if people think that right now, drug wars or things like that aren't occurring, and they basically pitch it as if all of a sudden they'll be happening now that Bitcoin is going on. Well, as a matter of fact, all of this stuff has already been happening. It's just been happening with cash. And ironically, Bitcoin is actually more traceable than cash. And the reason for that is because of the public ledger, the blockchain that I mentioned before. So the blockchain, like I said, is this public list of all transactions that have ever occurred. Law enforcement agencies, FBI, CIA, whatever, if they're watching that closely, they have the ability to track back, although it doesn't say like your name, but it just has the address, to track back where this money is coming from and where it's going to. And basically that means that these transactions are not really anonymous. So it's kind of interesting. The more you understand the protocol at the technical level, the less you are actually concerned with it being really anonymous. There are some other more legitimate concerns about Bitcoin, one of which is the security question. So traditional Bitcoin addresses have one private key and one public key. The private key, like I said, is the digital equivalent of a safe deposit box key. The public key, instead, is what's used to derive your Bitcoin address. And your Bitcoin address is where people can send you money. So it could be like a mailing address where you would send a check. And that key pair gives you access to the coins. If the private key is compromised, so it can be compromised because somebody hacks your computer and steals it, or because, let's say you put your private keys on an external hard drive, this actually happened, and you do some spring cleaning, and you say, oh, I don't need this junk, and you throw it away, and then a few hours later, you realize that you just threw away $7 million. That's always a bad Wednesday. But basically, this is a real issue that affects Bitcoin. And so in order to make sure that that kind of thing doesn't happen, there was a modification made to the protocol which allowed for the creation of multiple keys. So what that means is, rather than just having one key, which if you lose it, you're actually screwed, you have several. And basically you need a subset of those keys in order to transact. So BitGo, the company that I work for, pioneered a model of 3 total keys, 2 of which are needed to transact. And essentially what that means is that you no longer have a single point of failure. You have the ability to either lose one key or have something go wrong and still have access to your funds. Particularly, this is useful in terms of defense from hackers. So a lot of the major Bitcoin exchanges have been hacked. But if you have to steal multiple keys, which are being stored in separate places, not online, it becomes very difficult for anybody to actually successfully do that. So that's kind of a core layer of security that's needed to make the ecosystem much more secure. In terms of financial privacy, there's also some concerns because, again, like I said, despite the idea that Bitcoin is anonymous, in reality, the list of transactions is public. And so, say I'm a hedge fund, I don't necessarily want everybody to know how much of my assets are being stored in Bitcoin, or who controls those coins, because people could make threats on my life, people could just gain market information that they shouldn't have. Or, for example, let's say I work for a company that pays its employees in Bitcoin. Well, I receive coins from a certain address, so I know that that is the payroll address that's paying me, and I can see what other transactions that they've made on a particular day when they pay the employees. And so from that, I can basically deduce, well, okay, these are probably my coworkers' paychecks. I can see how much they're making and make sort of inferences from that. And that's not necessarily something that you want. And this has nothing to do with Bitcoin being used for illegitimate purposes or things like that. You don't post your bank account balance online, so why should you post your Bitcoin balance online? And so there was, again, another modification made to the protocol a couple of years ago, which basically enabled the creation of what are known as HD addresses. HD stands for hierarchical deterministic, not high definition, so not the same as your TV, addresses. But what these do is it basically allows for the creation of new addresses that are linked together privately. So I can manage them all from the same place, and they all fold into the same Bitcoin wallet. So similarly as if they all folded into the same bank account, like a checking and a savings account. But you can't tell that from the blockchain. So somebody who's looking at the public ledger can't see, oh, these are all the transactions that are associated with Arianna. So, those are some of the concerns. But the great thing about Bitcoin is that it's constantly evolving. So it's a living piece of software. There are people, hundreds, thousands of developers working on it every day. And they're really basically solving, some of the smartest people in computer science are working on solving the biggest problems with the network, which is pretty exciting in the sense that a lot of the concerns with the original versions are being addressed on an ongoing basis. So let's see, what is next in the magical world of Bitcoin? I think where you really start to get interesting stuff is not thinking about Bitcoin as an alternative to something that you're already doing, but really when it can enable entirely new activities. So when the internet came about, it didn't just let you do things that you were already doing physically. It enabled entire new modes of communication, allowed for entirely new industries and things like that. And Bitcoin has very similar potential. So I'll just briefly mention a few industries and a few possible use cases that I find particularly interesting. So the sharing of digital resources is really, really pretty cool. So, let's say you have an excess of storage space. You can basically make that available via the blockchain to other people on the network who pay you small amounts of Bitcoin to store their files. Same thing you can do with bandwidth. So let's say you're traveling and you want to use somebody's Wi-Fi, but you don't want to make an account because you're in Denmark and that's a pain. Well, you can automatically pay somebody to use their Wi-Fi using Bitcoin. And all of these things are happening at the protocol level. So it's not something that has to be done manually or that I have to go and do. It just happens, which is the best way for tech to work. You can actually use it to make money as well. So let's say you have extra data, somebody can buy that off of you, and so that comes out of your monthly bill. These kinds of, the things I'm talking about now are not currently in existence, but if any of you guys want to work on them, come talk to me after. So another thing which I touched on briefly is international microfinance. So there are 5 billion people who within a very short amount of time are going to be connected to the internet via a smartphone. But they still won't have access to credit, to banking, and things like that. And so Bitcoin allows things like peer-to-peer lending. So right now you have to go through a bank to get a loan or something like that to start a small business if you're in Zambia, Zimbabwe, or anywhere else. But now you can actually get a loan directly from another person on the network without having to go through such an institution. And the great thing is that all of these things, it doesn't have to be a handshake contract or anything like that because it's all recorded in this publicly accessible ledger. Marketplaces are another really interesting thing. So let's say, you might be familiar with Mechanical Turk. Basically, people in, for the most part, other countries will do simple tasks online for you and, be paid. The problem with running such a service is that it's really difficult to pay people out, even if they do have bank accounts, and it's pretty much impossible if they don't. So what does this mean? It means that there's a huge subset of the global market pool which is cut off from having access to this kind of work because they're not able to get paid. So they ironically have access to the internet, but they have no way of getting money out of it. And so by using something like Bitcoin, they can, like I said, have their own wallet and basically function as their own bank and be paid for this kind of work. So it's really opening up the global market for labor in a way that hasn't been done before. Something that is kind of more in line with your day-to-day is incentivized social software. So, right now, if you want to approve of something, you can like it, you can star it, you can heart it, depending on what kind of social network you're using. You can upvote it if you're on Reddit. But so far, you haven't really had the ability to attach a monetary compensation to that sort of approval. But with Bitcoin, you can do things like microtipping, and this has been happening organically already on sites like Reddit. So people are tipping each other with Bitcoin, Dogecoin, other cryptocurrencies, just of their own volition, because they're like, oh, that's a great question, or that's a great answer, or things like that. And so this is something that can become more institutionalized, more kind of ingrained in a lot of this social tech sphere. If you think about MySpace, for example, at a certain point they had, if you guys are like, oh, what's that? I'm not that old, so it was a bit after my time as well, but I'm sure you've all heard of it. But basically, MySpace had, at some point, a huge number of users, very engaged user base, and they also had a ton of musicians who were on the platform and were keeping their music there. So it's a really interesting kind of mental exercise to think about how might things have played out differently for MySpace if they had had the ability to tip musicians and kind of interact with people who are posting music there in that way. Which leads me to my last innovative use case, which is art. And this is one of the ones that I find most interesting, because who thinks of Bitcoin and says, we finally have a solution to funding the arts? No, probably not very many people. But it's actually really fascinating because it's a means for people to support the creation of digital art, whether that's actually like graphics, whether that's music, whether that's independent films, any kind of artistic project. Patrons can basically tip and put their monetary approval on a project, which allows the project to be funded kind of like it would be with a Kickstarter or something like that. There's also things like paid metering. So if you want to watch an independent film, you don't necessarily have to just pay a lump sum like you would if you were buying it through Apple TV, but you can actually use metered payments. So every few seconds, a small Bitcoin payment happens automatically, and that goes to the creator of the content. So those are basically the, and then you can basically track the ownership of such digital assets on the blockchain as well. Because the blockchain, as much as it contains all of the transactions, it can actually contain other things. So you can do things like legal contracts that are held on the blockchain. Tracking, again, the ownership of digital assets and things like that. You can actually buy and sell a house and have a legally enforceable contract on the blockchain. So all of these things, which sound super crazy right now, are going to be in full effect within the next 5 to 10 years. So it's definitely an interesting space to be in, for sure. So I think that kind of should give you an overview of what's going on right now. I can talk about any of these subjects at great length, but I'm curious to see if anybody has some questions to start. And yeah.
Can you wait for a microphone so that they can hear you online? Do you want to go to this one?
Oh, sorry, you got ditched in favor of the closer microphone. It's a geography-based importance system, apparently. Yes?
Hi, my name is Joshua Petrago, and I'm a senior in IST. For me, I think the biggest issue with Bitcoin, I think, for the public is how do you get the general public, not just, an IST convention like this, to fully understand how Bitcoin works? How do you think, what would be the fastest way to get the general public to really understand Bitcoin? Because I think people in this room still don't really understand how the technology works in Bitcoin. They understand the ideology, but the actual technology.
Yeah. So I'm kind of going to give you a cop-out answer, which is they don't need to. Do people know how the internet works? Do people know how a refrigerator works? Do people know how a car works? Probably not. If you poll the majority of users of the internet, can they explain how servers and TCP/IP works? No. So the real answer is we're not done until Bitcoin is so simple to use that you can just use it and it magically works and you don't have to know how it works. I think tech is never finished. And the reason you know that is if you have to know what a private public key pair is or anything about cryptography in order to actually functionally use it, the product, or Bitcoin in this case, is not good enough. And I think what's going to really drive consumer adoption, what's going to allow the network to expand, is basically for companies to be creating services and products that abstract away the complexity of it. Actually, one thing I've learned in doing some of these talks and just having conversations with people is that most of the general population doesn't actually understand how the banking industry works. So you don't necessarily have to know how banks are operating on the back end to be able to log into your Chase account and see your balance. And similarly, you don't have to understand how Bitcoin works to actually transact with it. My role at BitGo is basically I sit on the wall between marketing and product, and so my job is essentially to say, no, this is not good enough because you still have to know X, Y, Z things. And until it's so obvious to use, so intuitive that you can fully use it without knowing anything about Bitcoin, we're not done.
Can you explain how Bitcoins are created? And I understand there will be a maximum number at some point that would be allowed to be created. Can you speak to that?
Sure. That's a very complicated question, so I will try to give a brief answer. So, sorry? Repeat the question. Yes. So the question was, how are Bitcoins created, and there's going to be a maximum number. How does that all work? So basically, Bitcoins are created through a process that's known as mining. And the way mining works is that essentially it's an incentive for network participants to validate transactions. So what happens? Well, these miners are basically solving mathematical equations and validating blocks of transactions. So what that means is there's a bunch of transactions that come to the network, and they need to basically do some calculations and look backwards at the previous transactions to verify that the amount of money that's trying to be spent in a transaction is actually in the ownership of the person who's trying to send it. So, for example, I want to send 5 Bitcoins to my friend Lisa over here. And in order to do that, though, the miners have to check that I actually have 5 Bitcoins to send. So what do? They look back at the public ledger and they say, well, Arianna received 10 Bitcoins from her mother and 12 from her brother. So yes, she does have enough Bitcoins to actually spend. And so basically, the miners are the ones who are in charge of ensuring the network security by verifying that the transactions are valid. In reward for doing this work, they receive Bitcoin. And Bitcoins are awarded at a decreasing rate over time. So basically, approximately every 4 years, the amount of Bitcoin that's released for completing a block, or basically verifying a block of transactions, is cut in half. And there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins in circulation. Right now, we're at about 13 million. You might say, okay, well, 21 million of anything is not enough to support the entire global financial system. We currently have like trillions of dollars, and that's just one currency. How does that work? Well, Bitcoins are actually, okay, I'm going to blow your mind. Bitcoins don't actually exist. What I mean is it's all transaction-based. So the concept of a Bitcoin is not real. We denominate transaction amounts in Bitcoins because otherwise it's kind of too hard to think about conceptually. But Bitcoins are actually, can be divided to any number of decimal places. The current amount is 10 to the negative 8th is how many bits go into a Bitcoin. So basically, right now, we denominate prices in Bitcoins because the cost of a total Bitcoin is, $220 or something like that. But in a world where Bitcoin becomes a much larger part of the global economy and the price rises to $100,000, it's no longer practical to denominate in Bitcoin units, but therefore then we'll start denominating in bits, which is actually already happening if you're, for example, trading Bitcoin or doing things like that. I don't, oh, you got the microphone. All right, awesome, go.
Hello? All right. So my question is actually, I'm glad that was asked first because that was part of my question. So a lot of criticism around Bitcoin has been, it's been viewed as like a commodity because there is a limited amount of them. Can you speak to like the regulations that are being put in place around like one entity owning? So for example, like the US government owns a large portion of the current Bitcoins in circulation, and how they're going to like control how basically the regulations around them like controlling price based on the amount they have.
Yeah, so the US government actually doesn't hold enough to significantly impact the price. It's actually really funny because people are like, oh, well, the government has been a little bit wishy-washy as to how they feel about Bitcoin. And then I'm like, oh, but they're literally selling it. So clearly, it can't be illegal if the government's selling it, right? But basically, in terms of how it's being dealt with from a regulatory perspective, it was classified, and this was not a law. This will be several years before it actually becomes a law, and it may very well be changed before it goes into effect. But it was classified as a piece of property. So the rules that apply to it are exactly the same as would apply to a stock. So you would pay like capital gains tax on it. The classification is actually incredibly impractical, and I really doubt that it's going to go into full law as it currently stands. The reason being that basically, when you buy and sell a stock, you have to pay taxes on the difference, how much you made, depending on like whether it's short-term, long-term capital gains, and all that sort of stuff. In Bitcoin, that's incredibly impractical because you're using it to buy objects. So hypothetical scenario, like Overstock.com accepts Bitcoin. Let's say I buy a Bitcoin at a certain amount, then I wait 2 weeks, the price changes. I buy a couch. I'm now expected to calculate the tax dependent on the price at which I bought the Bitcoin and then spent it to buy a couch. And there's currently no threshold for the minimum amount. So what would make sense, in my mind, is to say, okay, well, let's say you want to classify it as a commodity. All right, I disagree with that, but let's just go with that for a minute. You could say, okay, we're going to set a $5,000 floor. So any transactions under $5,000, that we're going to exclude from this calculation. As it currently stands, that's not the case. So it is a gigantic pain to actually do your taxes in Bitcoin. Fortunately, there are companies that are coming out. There's one called LibreTax, which actually integrates with BitGo. It pulls all your transaction history and does it automatically for you, which is pretty great. But again, the regulatory environment is very much in shift right now. There are indications, but there are no fully baked laws, just because the regulators are also trying to wrap their head around the whole concept. And so they're like, oh, we don't know what to do. We'll just classify it as like a commodity and deal with it as if it were a stock, when in reality that's not the most practical thing to do. Does that answer your question? It's kind of vague. The answer is I don't have an answer because the people who make the answers don't have an answer either. So stay tuned. I actually wrote a blog post about this as well right after the IRS ruling came out. So if you go to ariannasimpson.com in the blog section, it might be interesting to you. Yes. Oh, wait. Sorry, I don't want to. Who has a microphone? Wave your microphone. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a question about some of the other forms of cryptocurrency. So I've heard of, I guess, some other alternatives similar to Bitcoin. So I was wondering what makes Bitcoin so unique and what prevents these other forms of cryptocurrency from kind of overtaking it in the next few years.
Sure. So right now, Bitcoin is 14 times larger in terms of like value than the next biggest altcoin is what they're called, which is Ripple. Litecoin is the biggest after that. But basically, Bitcoin has a humongous lead in terms of value and number of users compared to any other alternative cryptocurrency. The only scenarios in which I can actually see other cryptocurrencies overtaking Bitcoin are ones in which they actually have a practical value proposition for a specific use case. So what do I mean by that? Well, Litecoin does really, really fast verification. So it takes about 10 minutes to verify a transaction on the Bitcoin network. Litecoin can do it in something like 2.5. And so if you need lightning fast, like faster transactions, then Litecoin could be a solution. But in reality, most altcoins are kind of a joke in the sense that they basically took the core Bitcoin protocol, changed the name, maybe made a few small tweaks, but in many cases literally just replicated it and called it something else. So for a while, people were doing this as what was known as a pump and dump scam. So I would say, oh, I want to make some money this weekend, and I would make Arianna coin. And I start selling Arianna coin, like literally people did this / do this, but now it's not as popular. And so all of a sudden, I sell these for 50 cents a coin, and then, I make a bunch of money because I sell off mine, and then the price collapses because it was an artificially created market for which there was no real demand, but it was just kind of hype that was sending it up for a little bit. So the reality is a lot of these cryptocurrencies don't actually have any value proposition beyond what Bitcoin already has. Bitcoin has a huge head start, so unless some of them can come up with an innovative value proposition, they will not catch up to Bitcoin.
All right, being that Bitcoin is like the first and most popular digital currency, what is the potential for malware attacks on Bitcoin, such as like a botnet like a large botnet injecting false entries into the blockchain?
So because the blockchain is stored on all the nodes of the network, it's actually really difficult for something like that to happen because it's so publicly visible and so widely held. That's one of the benefits of it being decentralized. If it's a single bank's database, something like that can happen because you just have to figure out how to penetrate their systems. And if you do that, then you can affect the network. Bitcoin's a lot more difficult. One of the biggest concerns that you hear on that front is what's known as a 51% attack, which basically means that if one single mining pool, so miners who are verifying transactions often pool together because it ends up being more profitable for them to do so. And if one mining pool ends up having more than 51% of the hashing power, so more than 51% of the energy input, basically, that is going into the network, then they have the ability to do that. They can fork the Bitcoin protocol in a different direction and do exactly what you said. In reality, this is not too much of a concern because if they were ever to do that, A, it would be immediately evident to everybody else on the network. And B, what that would cause is everyone would totally lose faith in the network, which would plummet the price. The reason for which you would do that would be to spend coins in a way that's not actually legitimate, so you could spend to yourself. But the counter side is that Bitcoin would essentially then become valueless because if the network doesn't work and anybody can just make up a sum of money, well then nobody's going to use the network anymore. So they would basically be tanking their own money by doing that. So it's not really too much of a concern. The other thing is that, yes, there are some concerns around basically injecting malicious JavaScript into the browser. So let's say I'm entering a Bitcoin address to send money to. What could happen is some sort of malicious JavaScript attack changes the address and sends my coins to somewhere else. Like it changes a digit or whatever. And so, yes, in that case, you could actually lose money. So what's being done on that front is basically alternative forms of identity verification. So right now, your Bitcoin address is just this like long string of numbers and letters. But what's happening now is that there are other companies and open source sort of projects that allow you to send money to an individual, which makes it a lot harder to do that. So you can verify your identity publicly using something like Twitter or social media networks, and then type in, I want to send this money to Arianna. And so that has my Bitcoin address on the back end, but it's not visible, so that kind of attack becomes more difficult. Okay, I don't know what the microphone situation is. Okay, you've got one.
Okay. Yeah. So you were talking about the ledger before. I'm looking at it now, and it says either the IP address or the username of the person sending it and how much money they're sending. But for law enforcement that wanted to find illegal activity, how do they? You can't see what they're sending. So how do they figure that out?
What do you mean by what they're sending?
Well, I mean the whole point of, like you can't see that they're sending drugs or anything, or...
Oh, well, no, you wouldn't see that. It's not like they're going to write drugs. Payment for drugs. No, it's basically just, what you can see, though, is the transaction amounts and the send and receive addresses. So this is, it's very complicated. I'm not saying that you can just stare at the blockchain and all of a sudden you'll know like who's sending and receiving money. But there are ways, if you know what you're doing, to basically track back transactions. So for example, let's say, they discover that a certain address was owned by Silk Road, which was, allowing people to basically create a drug marketplace. And so they know that that address belongs to somebody who's doing something illegal. Then they can say, oh, look, these 10 addresses paid to Silk Road. So we should go investigate those and see if we can figure out who owns those and what they were paying for. So it's not a game of like, oh, you just look at this like public list of who exactly was sending and receiving what, but you can make deductions based on the past transaction history and the links between transactions that have happened over time.
So Bitcoins are being released through these miners, correct, who are giving up their computing power. Once all the Bitcoins are released, how are the miners going to get paid without?
Very good question. First of all, we'll all be dead, so don't worry about it too much. That should happen around 2040. Basically, the miners are also making money from transaction fees. So you can basically choose if you would like to append a transaction fee to a transaction you're sending to the network. So that's right now, it's pretty much optional. But if you don't, there's the possibility that the miners don't include your transaction in the block. So they're like, well, I can do this one for free, or I can do this one for X amount. Obviously, I'm going to take the one that I get paid for. So right now, your transaction's probably going to get in and be verified, but it just may take longer. So you can kind of pay to prioritize your transaction right now. In terms of the long-term viability of the system, that's not a problem that's been completely solved in the sense that, yes, right now a lot of the incentive for the miners to perform the work they're doing is because of the block reward. Eventually, it may be that transaction fees are able to fully sustain the network, and therefore it operates in that way. which is probably the most likely solution. Of course, you could say, oh, well, then if the fees go up enough, then it won't be any more cost efficient than the current system. But the hope and what people are working towards, they're not just sitting there optimistically hoping, like they're actually trying to solve it programmatically, is that it will be efficient enough that the transaction fees won't have to be that high and the network will still work.
One of the answers that I keep getting when I talk to people about using Bitcoin is that they don't want to use it because if the power goes out, they won't be able to access their money. So I was wondering if there was a solution for that.
Well, lols. Good luck trying to get your bank to work if the power goes out. I mean, there's a reason people keep like emergency cash stashes. I mean, it's no more, in that sense, it's no more or less problematic than your bank. It's not like your bank doesn't use power. I'm like, who are you talking to? I mean, no, I mean, think about it, right? So right now, your bank, even if you show up and the power's out, it's not like they have all your money sitting there. Like there's this lovely little thing called fractional reserve banking, which basically means that the bank is only required to keep a certain percentage of your assets or of its collective assets in storage. The rest of it is storage. The rest of it is like invested and put in other places. And that kind of amount is regulated by the government, et cetera, et cetera. But basically, like if the power goes out, you can't get your money anyways. Since when do ATMs work if you don't have any, like none of these systems are able to operate without power. So other than cash. So like, let's just all hope the power doesn't go out. Redundancy and generators, I guess, is the only answer I have. But that problem applies just as much to normal banking as it does to Bitcoin. Sure, whoever's got a microphone.
What do you think about Bitcoin's representing digital assets like colored coins does?
Yeah. I think that stuff is really, really interesting. So colored coins, for those of you who don't know, basically allows for sort of Bitcoins to be tagged in a certain way and associated with a specific type of digital asset. So, I mean, there's a lot of possible options and configurations for how this might work. But you could use it to buy and sell like property, like even physical property, like a house or a car or things like that. I think we are a long way away from having colored coins be actually viable. I met the founders. They're great. They're so awkward. It's amazing. But no, I mean, I think that they're brilliant. What I think is lacking is the actual like consumer mentality around it. So right now, like the idea of selling your car on the blockchain is still like, I mean, it kind of blows my mind, and I work in the industry. So I think realistically, we're probably like 10 to 15 years away from that being actually viable. I think it will be a lot easier for people to wrap their head around trading both digital and physical assets on the blockchain once Bitcoin is more common as like a payments network and a currency in general. Because it's kind of like colored coins is sort of a Bitcoin 2.0 sort of application. And right now we're a far, far cry away from even having full adoption of Bitcoin 1.0. So until we get further with just normal Bitcoin, it's going to be really hard to see that sort of stuff take off.
Yeah, about a year and a half ago, at the time, the largest company that was involved with processing, I guess, Bitcoin was hacked, and I think a couple $100 million worth of Bitcoin supposedly
Mt. Gox,
disappeared.
the infamous Mt. Gox.
Yes. What happened to the Bitcoins, I guess is the question. Do they know how it occurred? And the people who had these Bitcoins in their own accounts, what happened to them?
So the problem is the people didn't have their Bitcoins in their own accounts. If the users, so Mt. Gox, for those of you who might not know, was the biggest Bitcoin exchange. And it actually started out as a Magic the Gathering card, Gox, that's where the name comes from, card trading site, which was purchased by this guy, Mark Karpeles, who decided to make it into a Bitcoin trading exchange. And about $500 million were stolen or lost out of Mt. Gox. And everybody in the industry thinks it was an inside job. I mean, it's pretty clear at this point because what they described, they said there was a like a hot wallet leak from the cold storage, and that's actually not like scientifically possible what they described. So basically what everybody thinks is that somebody on the inside stole the coins. And the problem with that is that, or the problem with what happened was that people trusted Mt. Gox to hold their coins for them. If they had done what you're supposed to do, which is keep your coins in your possession and then put them on the exchange to trade and then move them back off when you're done, then none of this would have ever happened. But people were, sadly, somewhat foolishly, using the exchange as like storage, which it was never meant to be. And so when they were breached, aka made off with everybody's money, there wasn't really anything that an individual could do because they didn't control. The key in Bitcoin is always control your private keys. If you don't actually control your money. And what happened here is everybody just put their coins on the exchange, left them there, and then they had no way of retrieving them when things went wrong.
Is there a way to use the blockchain technology without anything to do with finance or Bitcoin at all, but just solely within decentralized data sharing of sorts?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of different blockchains actually that you can use. Like the Namecoin blockchain is actually used for like DNS purchasing, so you can buy like domains using that blockchain. You can use blockchains for things like legal contracts, so assurance contracts and things like that can be written into the blockchain so that at a certain point in time, a certain thing will go into effect. Oftentimes these will be linked to money, even if they're not directly financial transactions. But what I will caution is that having too many blockchains is actually not beneficial in the sense that the network security decreases when there are very few participants in the network. The whole point of it is being decentralized. So if I have a network that's only used for a particular small use case, it's probably not going to have that many nodes. The fewer nodes it has, the easier it is for me to hack them and modify the public ledger. And so ultimately, if you go all the way back and downsize it, you end up with a bank, like if you make the nodes few enough. So essentially, like, you don't want to have too many of these different blockchains because the security decreases. But yes, there are applications that are non-financial. Like I said, things like buying, they are often related to buying some sort of asset, but you could even do a trade. Like I could trade you a house for a car. So yeah, in some sense it's a transaction, but not in the purest like payments kind of form.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but Bitcoin, the price of a Bitcoin is valued at whatever the market sees it at, correct?
Yes.
So what changes the price of a Bitcoin? Like how does the market impact that?
Sure. So that is purely determined by supply and demand. So if you go on the website of any exchange, you can look at the graphs. I love to nerd out about exchange graphs, but basically you can see the buy orders, the sell orders, and you can see the pressure in one way or another. So sometimes you'll go in there and you can see like a giant buy order at a certain price, and so basically what happens is if there's a lot of people wanting to buy, that's going to drive the price up. If there's a lot of people wanting to sell, that's going to drive the price down. It's just very simple supply and demand economics.
I just have a quick question. How is Wall Street responding, and do you see traditional banking going away anytime soon?
So, traditional banks are really scared right now. It's very funny. I was at a sort of like a private cryptocurrency and banking roundtable thing with about 50 like senior people from banks in December, and they were all like, what do we do? Like, we know we need to be paying attention to this, but we don't necessarily, A, we don't understand how the tech works, and B, like, we can see that this is somehow threatening, but we're not even exactly sure how we're threatened right now. So the smart banks are trying to get ahead of it by hiring in people who know this stuff. The reality is that's hard because a lot of the people who are the most knowledgeable about the system built it because they don't like banks. So even if they're very well compensated, they're not about to go, work on Wall Street. But they are starting to take action. For example, Coinbase is the second best funded Bitcoin company in existence, and their most recent financing round, which happened I think in January, was $75 million. And they had participants like the New York Stock Exchange, BBVA, and a number of other like large traditional financial institutions. And that was not like a coincidence on Coinbase's part. They're clearly working on getting alignment with a lot of the traditional finance entities. Realistically, I don't think that it's, some people are like, oh, the banking industry is just going to get replaced by Bitcoin. Improbable. I don't think that's the case, nor do I necessarily think that that's desirable, because I think that there's a lot of ways in which the two can play nicely together. There are certain use cases in which banks just can't compete, and there are other use cases in which, you do need somebody to monitor certain activities. And so in that case, the banks can have a more effective role. So, the Wall Street community is definitely getting involved. Bitcoin now has a ticker on the stock market, which is like, when that happened, it blew my mind. I was like, oh wow, somebody other than me thinks this is a thing. Like, I'm not crazy. So it's cool to see them start to play into the industry. The reality of it is some cryptocurrencies are trying to work more closely with Bitcoin than others. So Bitcoin, in some sense, or some of them are trying to work with the banking industry. So Ripple, for example, is a Bitcoin blockchain-based technology, but that is completely dependent on interacting with the banking system in order to operate. So they basically replace some of the bank's internal infrastructure for facilitating transactions and things like that, and make it more cost efficient for the banks. So they are basically tailoring to the banks. Bitcoin, in some sense, competes with the banks. But again, I think there are definitely areas in which the two can work together because Bitcoin can't fully replace banks, at least not anytime soon. And but it does have certain advantages, especially for things like microtransactions and international transactions that banks can't do very cost effectively.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time here, but
okay.
I know it's a very hot topic, clearly. So
Come talk to me.
Sorry we couldn't get to your question, but we are asking all of our speakers one final question. So you probably touched on it all throughout your talk, but I guess one more time. Could you share with us what you believe the next big thing or the next wave will be in your industry?
Yeah, I guess I kind of talked about that towards the end, the 5 things I went through. Personally, I'm really, really excited about the international financial markets. I think that Bitcoin has the ability to improve the lives of literally billions of people by giving them access to banking, access to credit, access to labor markets that they could never have played in, just a few years ago. And I think that as we're seeing this wave of people coming online, like Facebook itself has a lot of initiatives to get people connected, the infrastructure is coming along. And so the ability to have these people participate in the global economy, not just as passive observers, but as actual contributors, is probably the thing I'm most excited about.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you very much for your time, and let's give a round of applause for Arianna.
Thank you.